Anyways, just to reiterate, thank you all for coming this evening and for your support of the Children's Discovery Institute. As you've already heard, I think the CDI has gotten up to a terrific start in its first 4 years, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity to be part of it. So at the core of the CDI is research to make new discoveries. And as I think everyone in this room can appreciate, research is really the only way that we can develop new and innovative approaches for serious pediatric diseases. Research includes studies that both allow us to better understand the cause of serious childhood diseases, improve methods for their diagnosis, and ultimately treatment or even prevention. Now in a few minutes you'll get a chance to hear about some of the work being done by some of the CDI-funded investigators. But before that, I'd like to just give you just some very brief perspectives on how the research process works. So all discoveries begin with an idea. And this happens after reading an article in the medical or scientific literature, after seeing a patient in the clinic and trying to figure out what's going on with them, after seeing the results of new experiments in the lab or hearing about a study in the clinic, or just sitting around and brainstorming with colleagues. But you have this idea, so what happens next? Well, the next step is to really critically evaluate this idea. Is it a good idea? And you have to come up with a hypothesis that lets you really critically test the idea. Now the next phase of the work is really equally as important. You have to plan the investigation. What methods are you going to use? And this could include what kind of experiments, what kind of equipment do you need, how are you going to design this in bench research or in a clinical study, how many patients do you need, what kind of data do you collect, how do you approach this. And once you get to this point, then you're ready to do the studies. And this is actually the point where we in the CDI will get grant applications. People will come up with an idea, they've figured out what the questions are, have written down a plan, and then are proposing to do the investigations. So the next thing is really the acid test. You have to proceed with the actual work to really test the hypothesis and validate the idea. And after a whole lot of work, you can finally analyze the results and decide what is your conclusion. Was this idea correct or not? It may not have been. You may have gotten unanticipated results that will have you go in a new direction. So then the next steps then obviously build upon the findings that you've had in the first phase of the work. So in some cases you'll have new directions for your study or expand the study, new ideas for diagnosis, are we ready to start doing things in the clinic? And in many cases, as you heard, people then now take these original data and then apply for larger grants from external funding agencies to expand or in some cases redirect the idea. Then after this, the really cycle just starts all over again. Now, a final aspect I'd like to point out, and this has actually been brought up several times already this evening, is that collaboration among investigators is a key component to really all of these steps. And I think that's one of the great features about the CDI is that it brings together investigators from different disciplines, different backgrounds, because everyone's going to have different perspectives on how to attack a problem. And you can get things going from many different angles. So this is the goal. We all know where we're kind of going in a research project, and sometimes we're really lucky, and this is actually how research really happens. Just wow, we figure it out right away. But the actual path is usually much more complicated than that. It's often up and down, it works or it didn't work, you're not really sure what happens, or even more horribly, sometimes it's this maze of blind alleys that you have to follow and get lost in for a while before eventually you figure out where you want to end up and have your goal. So this is actually more and more realistic. Another point I want to make is that research always builds on earlier discoveries. We're not coming up with things just from ground zero. I'd like to give the example of a childhood disease, respiratory distress syndrome in premature infants, which actually now is pretty much unheard of. This is something that happened throughout my training as a pediatrician. And this work really began in the 1930s when people realized that in the lungs, the air sacs in the lungs are lined with a surface active ingredient, which keeps the air sacs open when you breathe air in and out, prevents them from collapsing. And in the 50s, it was realized that premature infants that developed something called hyaline membrane disease, where even if you were born 8 weeks earlier, over time, once you started breathing air, your lungs would completely white out, and you would really be unable to take oxygen in the bloodstream, and you would end up dying. that the problem was that their lungs didn't have this material, this lung surfactant. They weren't biologically ready to make it yet. So a whole lot of work went on in the 60s trying to work out the physiology of the surfactant and how it really worked in the lungs. And then subsequently people studied the biochemistry, like what was this stuff made of, how could we work with it, and being able to test like when you were able to fix the lungs in babies. And finally in the 80s, and this is when I was a resident, very first clinical trials where people took, sounds very primitive today, I don't know that this study would actually pass muster now, but they took extract from cow lungs that contained surfactant and started the initial trials to ask the question, could this work? Could we deliver it into the lungs of babies and improve the respiratory distress syndrome? In fact, it worked. So because that worked, then efforts went into developing artificial surfactant, something you can actually make chemically, and that was introduced in the clinic. And now, for the past 10 years, this is really, every baby will get this at a certain stage, and you just really never see this disease anymore. So this is really a remarkable body of work. It obviously took a lot of work from many, many different investigators, many different actors across countries to accomplish this, and really each was a stepwise process. And actually a number of investigators here, Dr. Seshkal and Dr. Aaron Havas at St. Louis Children's and WashU were key players along in many of these studies. But it definitely took a village. So CDI funds research, as you already heard, in a number of different areas. The backbone programs is grants to individual investigators to study an idea. We tend to favor, as you heard, young investors and grants to bringing together people from different disciplines. Another very important type of grant we support is something called a core resource. And this is a large, very expensive set of equipment or technology that is too expensive for any one laboratory to have, that then you can tap into. And these resources are have been made available to across really the WashU campus for people to take advantage of. It includes things like the Brain Tumor Bank or next generation DNA sequencing to help with studies to understand how genetic variation can really increase the risk of complex diseases such as asthma or leukemia. In addition, there's funding to support talented young faculty, and finally, and I think very important, our educational initiatives to provide support for students and fellows, because we need to train the next generation of pediatric scientists. So again, just to mention again, collaboration is integral to the research process. Just like everything else, research benefits from networking, both between ideas and people and just bringing people together. Currently, CDI projects are based in any one of 4 groups that you can see here: congenital heart disease, McDonald Pediatric Cancer Center, the Center for Pulmonary Disease, and the Center for Musculoskeletal and Metabolic Diseases. And having people in these sort of working groups really promotes exchange of ideas among people in those groups. And then, in addition, we expect actually interactions to be happening in between the groups, and just from, in fact, going to events like this. And actually, I just heard a story actually in the session beforehand that last year somebody was giving a talk and someone jumped out of their chair and said, "Hey, I know how to do that technique, let me help you." So it's just really bringing people together. Final point I want to make is that the CDI funded research is at different points on the so-called discovery pipeline. And here's just a little cartoon of, for some reason my little pointer is not working very well. That includes very early stage research and discovery. Some of this is super basic in the lab in a test tube. And ultimately, you get some ideas that then you can do some preclinical studies in animal models, and then you're ready for the clinical development phase. And different CDI funded projects are at different points along this pathway. And then ultimately, obviously, the patient is our underlying goal. It's clearly these early phase studies are very important. You have to sometimes get that critical new insight into what is causing a disease in order to know, well, what are we going to do to either better diagnose it or treat it. And then ultimately, at some point, you'll be ready to move from the animal models into patients. Some of the studies involve studying patients and trying to figure out, what we saw in the lab is correct in the patient. That's very important. And then ultimately, as I said, we'll have new ideas for diagnosis, treatments, and in some cases, even prevention.